Yeah, I'm Michael Harris from Epic, which is an international healthcare software company located right outside of Madison. It's one of the major employers of the area, and it provides the software that hospitals and clinics around the world use to care for their patients. So that's everything from doctors, nurses, schedulers, billing, and so on. And I'll share about my personal journey, which has taken a variety of turns and hopefully can serve as an illustration to you of how you can shape your career path to incorporate your interest in language skills, even if you end up in an industry that isn't specifically focused on languages. So in college, I studied French and Arabic and majored in international political economy and Arab studies. And I wasn't sure what route I should take for career. I knew I was interested in international affairs, economic development, the Middle East, and Arabic. And I definitely didn't expect that my career would take me into the technology sector where I'd be working for a software company one day. But that actually ended up working out really well. So my junior year of undergrad, I did an immersion program in Amman, Jordan, studying Arabic at the University of Jordan, living with a host family. And for 2 afternoons each week, I volunteered with a nonprofit organization that implements employability training programs for youth and women. And living abroad was a great experience, time of growth, and opportunity to improve my Arabic. And I figured that I'd like to work abroad again someday. But thinking about my family connections back in the US, I'm originally from Georgia. I knew that I wanted to at least start out in the US. So my senior year, looking toward graduation, I looked at various private sector jobs and ended up going with a job at Epic as a quality assurance software tester, which at first glance doesn't seem exactly relevant to what I had studied. But I'll go into how I was able to kind of incorporate my background. So once in the role, I looked for ways that I could still practice my languages. Epic has various employee clubs. It's a large company with over 10,000 employees. And they have a variety of employee clubs called Motley Crews. And so I connected with the Arabic Language and Culture Club, which is a mix of different language levels from native speakers to beginners who have just dabbled with the language. And we organized Arabic conversation sessions, dinners, movie nights. And it was a great way to continue to use the language. And through that club, I learned that Epic actually has in-house translation teams for a variety of languages, and including Arabic and French that I had studied. And employees can devote some of their work time to help with translation of patient-facing screens. So for instance, when a patient comes into the clinic or hospital, there's a welcome kiosk. And it's easier if the patient can fill out their registration information and say that they're here for their appointment if they can use the language they're most comfortable with. So Epic supports the welcome kiosk in over 24 languages and is looking to expand based on what language skills its employees actually have, where they can devote time to help translate that. There's also a MyChart patient portal that patients use to schedule appointments, to message with their doctor, to refill prescriptions. And so being able to offer that in other languages is very helpful for increasing access for healthcare services to people who aren't necessarily comfortable with English. And the other patient-facing kind of development that Epic has is after visit summaries. So after a patient sees their doctor, they'll be given a summary of their visit and instructions about what medications they're going to be taking and what diagnosis they had. And so being able to have that be in the language that they're comfortable with is really helpful for making sure they're empowered to take care of their own healthcare and make informed decisions. And so I joined both of these translation teams, the Arabic and French teams, and was able to keep using my language skills even on company time. And you don't necessarily have to be a native speaker to help with this kind of translation work. There are certainly native speakers that are working on these teams, and for trickier sort of areas, that would be more of the native speakers working on that. But then there are certain things where you can collaborate, and even if you don't have a very high level of proficiency in a language, you can still contribute. And it was also helpful to have where this is serving a purpose. You know, we're helping make healthcare more accessible to non-English speakers. And now Epic supports over 24 languages for patient-facing screens, so including less common ones like Hmong, Vietnamese, and Swedish, and they're regularly adding more languages to the mix. And my role as a software tester, I found there were some less direct ways that language knowledge helped me in that role too. So Epic makes software for hospitals and clinics and patients, and it has international customers, especially across Europe and the Middle East. And so all the software screens have to be translated into various languages so that the doctors and nurses and all those end users can use the software in their native language. And as a software tester, I was able to use my knowledge of Arabic, for instance, to give feedback about how a screen's design should be changed to better support right to left text. Or using knowledge about French gender agreement rules, I gave feedback to developers about how the current use of parameters to plug in words in a sentence on the screen might not work well in a gendered language. So if there's a sentence and it will plug in a noun that might be feminine sometimes or masculine other times, well, the words around that might not be appropriate if it's feminine. And so that wouldn't be a good way to structure the screen. So being able to use that language knowledge to give feedback can help make sure that the software, even from the earlier stages, is developed in a way that is better to internationalize it. And employees also sign up to support customers who are going live on the software for the first time. So Epic will send us to different hospital systems. And for the first 2 weeks that nurses and doctors and other users are starting to use the software, we will be helping provide at the elbow support to make sure that they are equipped with the right workflows and are able to still care for their patients effectively while they're learning the new system. And having a background that involved living abroad, I was able to travel to the Netherlands to help support end users there. It was mainly nurses in ICU, intensive care units, as they began using Epic for the first time. And I didn't know Dutch, but it was still helpful having some linguistic background knowledge. So for this trip, we had translators with us, since many of us, including me, didn't speak Dutch. But even without knowing Dutch, it was helpful to have that background in studying languages when trying to follow along as the end users showing a workflow with the screen translated into completely Dutch, and just being able to have that kind of familiarity with how different languages might be structured differently was helpful to be able to follow along a little bit more. Now, halfway through my career at Epic, I took a leave of absence to move to France and Russia for my wife's archival research. So she's a French and Russian history PhD candidate at UW-Madison, and she needed to spend 1.5 years in France and Russia to do different archival research for her dissertation. And so during that time, I worked as a freelance French translator. And we also studied Russian at Middlebury College, and then I continued studying Russian at Moscow State University. And that time has its own stories, so I don't want to go on too much of a tangent. But once I returned to Epic after that 2-year kind of stint, I was able to use my Russian language knowledge to serve as a localization manager for Epic's Russian translation team. And so I wasn't a Russian translator, but I was the manager of the work that the Russian translators worked on. So, and the goal of a localization manager is to make sure that we are translating what's appropriate to translate into Russian. So kind of curating which content do we actually need to have translators work on. And then evaluating, once we have that content translated, is it translated in a way that is appropriate for a Russian speaker to understand? So looking at their after visit summary and from a Russian speaking patient's perspective, and asking, would a Russian speaker find this helpful, informative, accurate? And then we would have corrections to go along with that. And so having some knowledge of Cyrillic and being able to understand some Russian was really helpful to be able to engage meaningfully with the translators. And as I returned after a couple years being abroad and returned to Epic, Epic had gotten a contract with its first French-speaking hospital system in Belgium. And Epic needed to translate its entire software into French, which is over 5 million words. And it had to be done before the customer went live with the system, because obviously everything needs to be in French for those French-speaking users to be able to complete their workflows effectively. And as is a trend for many projects in the private sector, the timelines were ambitious, and our full-time French translators of 5 people did not have enough time, and so they needed extra help. And so for 1 year, I was a full-time translator on the French team and helped them translate all the screens across the various modules that Epic creates for doctors, nurses, schedulers, etc. And we did complete the language package. And I had a good experience working with the translators. And so during that time when we were wrapping up the French language package, I transferred full-time to Epic's translation division, which is where I've been working for the past 2 years as a project manager. And so I'm not actively translating the software, but in this role as a project manager for the translation division, I help design and test the tools and workflows that our translators use to translate the software. And so having language knowledge really helps guide me in realizing if a tool or process might not be adequate to support how a particular language uses a set of characters or has certain grammar rules about punctuation or capitalization. One of our big focuses right now is we're working on ways to provide the translators more context, so they have a better contextual information about how various strings of text are used throughout the software, so that they, for instance, know how to translate a certain ambiguous word. If they see a string that's just the word schedule and they're asked to translate that into another language, well, they need to know, is that word being used as a verb or a noun? And that does affect the translation. And so we're working on ways to give them more context. And language study also helps you develop intercultural sensitivity, which is valuable in interacting with colleagues on a multicultural team. So the translation division has about 50 people from over a dozen countries, and across our various teams. We have different language teams, we have software developers who are making the tools, we have a support staff, and we have localization managers. And so it's an interesting mix of communication styles and cultural backgrounds. And so having that background of having studied languages and been abroad or interacting with people from different backgrounds is very helpful. And the software industry in general is becoming increasingly international focused. And so to reach more and more users all around the world, software companies have to support languages that don't use the Latin alphabet or that have different grammatical constructions. And the expectations are growing also for what these companies need to be able to provide. And having knowledge of less common languages or less commonly studied languages means that you can provide even more specialized insights about unusual edge cases that the designers of a piece of software or tool might have overlooked. And this trend toward globalization is relevant to most businesses today. You know, it's not just software, and that's certainly the case for Epic. So Epic, to give you a little bit more background about Epic, it started in 1979 and is entirely private and owned by employees. And its business grew by word of mouth, so they don't have a PR marketing team. And so growth was gradual until 2004, when it began working with some high-profile health systems across the US. And that raised its profile, and it's now just expanded a lot and has saturated the US market. And about 75% of Americans have their health data stored in Epic now. but only 4% of the world's population has their health data in Epic. So Epic's main areas for growth are definitely international. And like I mentioned, it has over 10,000 employees, and its headquarters is in Verona, Wisconsin, but it also has offices around the world. So there are offices in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Singapore, and Australia. And there are customers in all of those countries, plus several other countries where we don't have offices. And typically, the Epic staff who work in our international offices are implementation managers. So they'll help customers install the software and make configuration decisions. And if it's an international customer that speaks a language other than English, then they'll decide on terminology and translation guidelines. And so the implementation manager has to negotiate all those different factors, and they work alongside a hospital systems analyst team to make these decisions. And some customers even hire professional linguists as consultants to advise on how the software should be translated. And so the implementation managers have to negotiate between those linguists and Epic's translators and the customer teams to come to agreements on what sort of glossary conditions do we want to abide by, and what are our guidelines for how the language of the software should be. And so, of course, language knowledge and multicultural understanding would definitely be helpful for anyone who's navigating those discussions. And as the world becomes more connected, competitive companies are having to appeal to an increasingly international group of users. And one of the things that is motivating me about a career at Epic is how the software can make healthcare more accessible to patients and can give them more control over their health information and making decisions about their healthcare by us having the software be in languages that the patients can understand more readily. And as people who appreciate foreign cultures and languages, we can keep this higher purpose in mind, of increasing access and adapting in culturally sensitive ways. If you find yourself working in an internationally oriented company. And your role, wherever you end up, will likely involve tasks and responsibilities that go beyond just languages, but you can incorporate your interest and skills in whatever role you find yourself in, and try to shape your career path to take advantage of opportunities where you see them, and bring your language knowledge to the table. Thanks.